You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Tiffany Cruikshank. Our podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts, Rachel Land and Katya Barch, as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. And we want to have a more conversational episode this time, looking at a topic that is a question that often comes up for us in teacher trainings and our discussions, and a topic that we both feel really strongly on. And I think most people at Yoga Medicine as well. And I think hopefully really helpful for yoga teachers in particular. So the question was, I teach a wide range of students from teens to elderly, from high function to those with injuries. How do I offer options in my classes that appeal to everyone? If you stick to safety, it gets boring for some. If you challenge, it may be unhelpful for others. And this is such a great question. And I think a challenging one as a teacher to do it all, really.
I think this is almost the classic question, especially for newer teachers who, we really want our classes to be involving and exciting and popular, but we've also just spent months learning about how to align ourselves and engage our muscles to support our joints in poses, and trying to balance those two things sometimes feels like an impossible task. I don't think it is, but I think it kind of feels that way.
And I think teaching to a broad spectrum of levels within one class, so this kind of all levels class can be really challenging. I think in some ways it can be really easy, and in some ways it can be more challenging than like really level specific classes. But I really personally like teaching all levels classes. I find it really fun, and it can be a good challenge. And so here are our main thoughts. And I think the first one, the first one is the one that I feel most strongly about. And I know you do too, Rachel, but I think the most important answer to this is you have to teach to the stated level of the class. And, I just think this is so important if you're trying to grow a class, a group class, whether you're a studio owner or a teacher who teaches at the studio. I think it's so important to stick to whatever that class description is, whatever the class level is, because over time you will draw those people to you, and the new people will come in, will have their expectations met as well. There's nothing worse, I think, than as a student showing up to a class expecting one thing and getting something completely different. And then you just keep losing a lot of students instead of starting to attract. And I really think if you can stick to that, that will really help you build your classes over time. So that's just one.
Yeah, and it's easy to say, but it can be really hard to do, because most people become yoga teachers because we're, to some level caring and compassionate about others. We love the practice and we want to share it with other people. And it can be really challenging when you have a class and there are a couple of people in that class who don't really fit the stated class level. It's really natural to want to take care of the people that you can see in front of you. But you're right, it's a short-term fix that doesn't necessarily work for the long term. If you have a couple of brand new people come to your power vinyasa class, it's okay that they can't do every pose or practice in the class. Obviously, you don't just leave them to flounder. You might have a conversation with them first and say, look, these guys have all been practicing for a while. There are likely to be some options that are a bit challenging or require more flexibility than you have right now. Don't worry about keeping up with everything. In fact, don't worry about keeping up at all. Come along, have fun, listen to your body, do what feels right for you, and then keep coming back and see if things get easier or more interesting as you go.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of different ways to speak to that as well that we'll talk about as we go through. I think that's definitely one option. I think there's a natural flow to a progression of a class that leads for a lot of support to different levels. But I think to the class description, I think there's also the flip side of it being that there are a lot of ways to write a class description that can leave a lot of room for the teacher to come in with different ideas and different concepts. But again, I think as a student, the biggest thing that I want to know is like, how intensive is this going to be? What's the energy exertion or nourishment? Like, am I going to a yin and restorative class, or am I going to a really vigorous flow class, or is it more of a medium pace class? Like, for me, that's the most helpful thing. How advanced do I need to be? Will it be all levels? All levels is kind of, for me, assuming that there will be some cueing to guide everyone who's not brand new. Obviously, a all levels class isn't necessarily the best place for beginner, but we know there are always some. But I think how you write up that class description can be really interesting too. Like, if you want to do a very specific class, then speak to that, right? But if you kind of want to be able to, like, for me, I personally sometimes like to put in myofascial release. Sometimes we'll do more pranayama. Sometimes we'll do more something or other, maybe pose specific. And I like to have that breadth in my class description versus, for teachers who teach more regularly through the week, they might have one class that's very specifically myofascial release and flow, or yin and yang, or or more of a general one. So again, I think that the biggest thing is just sticking to that,
Yeah.
sticking to it. I think that's a pet peeve of mine when you go to a class and it's not that. And if you want to teach a more challenging functional class, keep speaking to that more and adding in more options for that. If you want to teach a less functional population to people maybe who have more injuries or specific issues, speak to that,
Mm-hmm.
both in the description and the class. And don't feel like you need to add the extra fancy options. If you want to teach a low back hair class, or a class for people with Parkinson's, or a class for something else, like, those are the obvious ones, right? You're not going to be thinking about fancy stuff. But I think really sticking to it is sometimes challenging too, because we get tempted to want to do more, or to
Yeah.
cater to the people in the room, which
Yeah.
of course we need to do to some extent, which we'll talk about, but
Yeah.
gotta stick
For
to
me,
that
the
class
challenging
description.
part as a teacher is often the class description is written by the studio owner, and I may or may not have any input to that at all. So if I don't, then I'm teaching to the class description that the studio has created. And I'm just trusting that the studio has a good, well rounded mix of classes so that everybody's needs at some point in the week are met. And if it is a brand new person coming to a level 2, 3 vinyasa class, then there are other options that I can direct them to. Or if they're looking for something really gentle and restorative, there are other options that I can direct them to. But over time, hopefully, you might be able to get into a conversation with the studio owner and talk about the fact that you'd like to run a really specialty class, or you'd like to start to introduce more myofascial release into your vinyasa. And hopefully, if you can show that there's your passion for it and student interest in it, you might be able to carve out places in the timetable that have more specific class descriptions to meet what you're really interested in doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great point too, and so you hope that there is um, either enough breadth in the studio description that leaves you plenty of leeway to stay well within that, and that also that the studio has a breadth of offerings too to support the different needs of the students. And if not, I think there's a moment for conversations with studio owners who are sometimes open to that and sometimes not. And as a teacher, then you have to decide what you want to do with that, whether you want to go somewhere else or you want to keep doing what you're doing. I think ultimately the other side of this is that people who come back get to know the teachers, and at some point they might be coming for the teacher too. Which, on a studio schedule, as a studio owner, it's nice to have those, like, basic styles so that it feels like a lot of options versus getting limited to just one teacher or one class a week. You want to have a lot of options, and as a teacher, you want your students coming back. I never want people just coming to my classes. I want them to come and partake. And I know that how once a week, and I don't teach a lot publicly, so once or twice a week isn't really going to be a lot, to keep them going. So
Yeah.
um, so that's the one thing. So I think the big answer here is, one, you have to teach to the stated class level. But the second one is something we've already kind of alluded to as well, is that we have to also think about safety of the students as well. And I think this is probably a longer answer, but we have to be able to keep people safe. So in this question, really was speaking to an all levels class. And I think the big thing here is that if I'm going to teach an all levels class, if I do want to add some things in that have a variety of options, I just want to make sure that I'm adding in enough clarity and cues so that they can safely get to one of those options, the most appropriate one. Right.
Yeah, and I mean this to me this is such a tough question because overall yoga is such a safe practice. I mean, compared to so many of the other things that we do in our lives. I mean, last time I hurt my neck, I was lying in bed and moving my legs. So, you know, you can hurt yourself doing pretty much anything. We all drive. Driving is a hell of a lot more dangerous than doing yoga. Many of the people that we teach are running or playing impact sports. They're a hell of a lot more dangerous than yoga. It's inherently a relatively safe practice because we're usually moving fairly slowly with only body weight, no impact. The whole premise of the practice is that it's mindful and that you're present to sensation. So I think generally it is pretty safe, but the idea that you could keep everyone, this is the word that I circled in that question, the idea that you could keep everyone perfectly safe is impossible. You're setting yourself up for failure because you don't know how hydrated your students are, what their stress levels are, what they've been doing for the entire rest of the day, whether they already have a little tweak or a niggle that they're nursing. You don't know what's going on inside their body. You don't know the shape and proportions of their skeleton. So the idea that you could keep everybody completely safe is impossible. You're setting yourself up for failure. So let's start the conversation by saying we're aiming for a reasonable middle ground. Perfect safety, impossible, but how can we provide options that give the bulk of our students somewhere that they can go?
I'm glad you said that. I totally agree. I mean, I agree. Yoga's very safe in the spectrum of things that we do, but nothing's completely safe, and I think um, our ability to support that is an interesting concept. I will say, for me, I think the thing that creates the most safety, again, the most we can in a yoga class, because there's a lot that's out of our control, is empowering our students to be their own teacher. For me, this is the crux of it all. I think a lot of times people come to yoga and um, they kind of hand over that ownership and that power in some ways to their teacher, as if their teacher would or even could know exactly what they're feeling and going through and needing and where their body's at, what their day was, what their life has been. There's just no way a teacher can know all of that, can know what is going on in their body. And so I think really the only way and the best way to empower people for safety is to really let them know that they're their own best teachers, to establish a foundation of listening, to establish a foundation of also being really truthful with ourselves. I think this is why Satya is one of the foundations of our yoga philosophy, the Satya, or truthfulness, to be discerning, to be able to know, am I being truthful with myself when I say I need to go further today? And sometimes that's true. We need to push ourselves in some ways. We know there are positive adaptations from pushing ourselves in certain directions, and I think pushing can have negative connotations in yoga, but we also need to be truthful to ourselves and like, hey, today's not the day to push myself. I got a lot going on. So I just need to be here and breathe and be in it and not worry about it. And that truthfulness does come from practice. But I think that is a reflection, an extension of empowering our students to be their own teacher. Only they know.
Oh, I couldn't agree any more vigorously with this without my head falling off. You've said two things there that I really want to underline to make sure that people hear them. And the first one is students are in charge. students are in charge, students are in charge. I'm not a guru. I don't have x-ray vision. I don't know how you're feeling. I don't know what you need. That's putting your teacher up on a pedestal that is unhealthy for both parties. So you've got to be in charge. And I say a standard disclaimer at the beginning of all of my group classes in person that I've created a sequence, but I didn't consult you when I created it. So it's likely that some of it won't work for you or won't feel right for you. So don't hesitate to leave things out, add in things that you like better, take a break, go more slowly, go more quickly, use props that I'm not using. So I think it's really important to say that explicitly, even though I wish I didn't have to, even though I wish people just knew that they had autonomy over their own bodies, and I have no inherent wisdom that tells me that this is what they need. So one, students in charge, student decides, everything is optional. But the second point that you made, I think, is equally important, because I think sometimes when the conversation centers around safety, the idea is that everything has to be gentle. We're barely moving, we're not adding any load, there's no level of challenge. And while that might be safe in the short term, that's not how we create resilience in the long term. For us to be safe over years, we need to be strong. We need to know how it feels to face a challenge and to grow in the face of that challenge, whether it's physical, mental, emotional, whatever. So there really is a place for doing awkward, uncomfortable, difficult things. It's just that it's not the teacher's place to decide when that's appropriate. And that's what you brought out so beautifully. It's up to each of us to be truthful. What do I really need today? Could I challenge my comfort zone a little? Or is this a day where I really need to refill and replenish?
I love that, and I think there's so much to this. I couldn't agree more. Amen to everything you just said. I think one of the interesting things here too, I was um, reading some things and preparing for class I was teaching the other week, and found this definition of compassion as being able to see clearly into the nature of our suffering. And I think this is such a big part of the yoga practice. It's not just the physicality. It's not just, or for me, it's not just the physicality. It's not just the philosophy. It's not just the breath. It's not just the meditation. It's the three dimensionality of the practice, and we can look at these physical challenges too and provide a space for inquiry, be able to approach it safely. So a lot of times that means offering really clear cues and progressions so that people can stop anywhere along the way. And, ideally being able to come into some sort of reasonable challenge and be able to examine and look into this nature of our suffering, and not to say that we're inflicting pain on ourselves, but any sort of discomfort or uneasiness that's not just like laying on the couch and eating bonbons. I think is a way to look at that to some extent. And for me, the postures aren't about inflicting a shape on the body, but really about looking at how these shapes become a mirror to how we see ourselves, to how we see the world, to how we respond and react. And so bringing in that three dimensionality to this practice provides a little bit more nuance, and also then layers for safety, because we are not necessarily bulldozing through, but we're still challenging, but we're challenging in a way that allows some reflection too. And I think that provides a little bit of a safety net too. But it also, and you might have more to say on the safety one in a second, but it also kind of leads us into the third one, if we're ready to go there yet. But the third one is really, how do we also bring fun into this as well?
Yeah, I mean,
So,
and that is the crux of the question. But you're right. I'm not ready to move off safety yet. I feel like I could talk about this for multiple podcasts. I probably already have. So I think the key was what you said there was inquiry as opposed to bulldozing, curiosity over determination. So when I think about the things that could make us or our students unsafe in a yoga practice, the sorts of things that come to mind are assuming a range of motion in people's bones and joints that they don't have, or assuming that they're feeling the challenge in the same place that you're feeling the challenge. So to me, open language, invitational language, and clear cueing of what you're wanting them to experience and where and how is the key. So if you're assuming everybody in your class can get to splits, you're probably going to end up in trouble with some of the people in your class. So you might offer options along the way. And what you're looking for is, a hip flexor stretch in the front of the back hip and maybe a hamstring stretch in the back of the front leg. And you can get people there in a range of different options, a runner's lunge, a hamstring stretch lying on their backs. So it's about being clear on what you're aiming to achieve and being open-minded as to how people get there and how far they go. Where we get into trouble is where we think we know the end point that every student can get to. We don't.
But I think we talk about language in here a lot. I just think as a teacher, we're constantly refining our language, and I know you agree with me wholeheartedly, and as I do about pretty much everything you've said on this episode. But I think another way to do that, which you're um, kind of speaking to a bit as well, is to offer curiosity. I think curiosity is another way to put them in the driver's seat of being in charge of navigating their experience, because the curiosity requires me to listen, right? So there's a listening inherent in curiosity, and then also to be open to being able to change that, because we know whether you're a competitive athlete, whether you're competitive desk sitter, whether you're a parent, whether you're all of those things or something else, there's a million things in our lives. Um, we all have these challenges and in life that make us need different things each day. And without that curiosity, there's this expectation that I need the same thing. And so the curiosity, I think, wakes up that listening, that truthfulness, that empowerment of me being the teacher. And I think the curiosity and the non-judgmental attention as to like concepts we come back to over and over again as like the crux of what we do, I think, in so many ways. But that non-judgmental attention also allows me to kind of step back and go, oh, just because she offered all these variations, and maybe I can do all these variations, doesn't necessarily mean that I need to. And I think that comes across in the nuance of how we say it, rather than like, do this if and then here's this one, and then if you can, here's the next one, and then if you can do this, you can do the next one, because that really pulls people into, can I? Okay, I can, so I will. Versus, if this sounds interesting to you today, try lifting your right arm here. And I think making it really simple, step by step. Like if I'm coming into revolved half moon, I'm just picking something, I can first just plant the foot and then start to lean my weight there, and then I can, and I can break down any pose like that into one movement at a time so that everyone can be a part of it. And I mean, as we all know, sometimes it's more challenging to be in process than it is to be in the full pose. So everyone gets something to chew on. And I think also when I'm offering options, it's often in a progressive way, as far as like the next one is harder, the next one is harder, but sometimes it's not. So that it kind of throws students off to not feel like I have to do it all. I'm the straight A achiever that has to do everything. It's more of, again, this kind of just assortment, like a charcuterie board of like, pick one, rather than like one being better or harder or fancier.
Yeah, we've talked about this on the podcast before. The conversation that's coming most to mind is the one that I had with Elena Chung about basically teaching all levels classes in a way that gives everybody something interesting to do. And she's a big fan of changing your language from, option 1 is here and you could stay here. But if you can, then option 2 is here and you could go there. But if you can do more, then option 3, that really hierarchical language can kind of trick people into thinking, oh, well, I don't want to be a wimp. I don't want to take the easy option. Whereas if we can flip our language around and say, if you want to stay and focus on endurance, you could hold here. If you want to bring your shoulders into it, you could lift the arm and go here. If you want to work on the flexibility of your front leg, you could shift forward, and, ways to couch the language around the feeling is going to differ, but one's not better than the other. It's just, what are you interested in? And here's the key word for me: today, because it reminds students that the choice that you make now is not your forever. This doesn't define you. And it requires you to think, well, how do I feel now? And what would feel right for me today?
Right. And I think words, I love words like if it feels interesting, if
Mm-hmm.
it feels helpful. All of these are really subjective. And I think the subjectivity also keeps you in the moment. It makes it feel very present moment aware to me. And, I think, and there's no judgment here. I think it's really easy as a teacher. It's really natural for us to just kind of start out with, when we're teaching, like, here's option one. If you can do this one, if you can do this one, and, it doesn't come from a bad place. I don't think that it's, us trying to, like, make people competitive, but I just think it's the nuance of being able to kind of get into people's minds a little differently and help them unlock their own potential and their own self-advocacy.
Yeah. And for me, you have already signaled toward this, but this is where the practice does get fun for me. It isn't necessarily, if you Googled fun yoga, you'd probably get images of arm balances and inversions and binds. But to me, fun yoga is that kind of curiosity and playfulness of, well, what do I feel if I do X, and what changes if I do Y? And for today, what does it feel like if I, like, that open, spacious, curious, playful, loose grip on the practice, to me, is where it gets really fun, where each week you're trying to think up juicy little ways to offer your students some options that soften their habits and patterns and remind them that there are different ways to do things. And if your idea of fun is, just learning to do arm balances, you're probably not going to keep coming to my classes. But if your idea of fun is, oh, that's interesting, let's see if I can do that. How does it feel when I do that? What do I need to do to, then great, you'll love my classes and you'll keep coming back and you'll learn a few different juicy little skills each week that we meet.
Yeah, I think we're both the same. We think, obviously, we're the same in a lot of different ways. We think along the same lines. We are obviously drawn to each other for some reason, but for many reasons. But I think we both really draw students who are curious, and yoga medicine as a whole draws students who are curious. And, that curiosity might be to getting upside down at times. It's actually not that often that I teach inversions, though I do love doing them and offering them as options. I think, the fun part is obviously subjective. And so I know in my 20s, what was fun for me is not the same thing that's fun for me now. I think for me, what's fun then was, again, inversions and air balances and how much can I do, which was a really interesting challenge for me and what I needed then. For me now, I think it's more really interesting and curiosity, like, hey, let's hack our nervous system today and see what happens when we, like, rev up the nervous system to start our class and do some more sympathetic breathing exercises and practices and vigorous movements, so that then we can more easily downshift at the end of classes, like a yang to yin practice that people tend to really love. And or maybe it's looking at the rotator cuff, or looking at, there's a million other things that you can see on Yoga Medicine Online. We've got, I think we're edging in on that. I know I have almost 500 classes now. I think we're edging in on 1,000 altogether. So there's a lot of options, and pretty much all of them, really the thing that we do first and foremost is create purpose driven content. So, and I think this is the benefit of practicing online, is you can be really purposeful in what you need and what you want. When you go to a group class, you have to really be open to what the teacher is offering. To some extent, you hope they teach to the description and the class level, but you do have to be kind of open. And so, yeah, I agree. I think fun can be really interesting. It can be playing some music. It could be partnering up. These are things I don't do as much, but I think for some people that can be fun.
Yeah, and fun could be adding in a new modality, like tossing in some myofascial release for people who are fresh to that, or trying out some breath work. Just giving people tools that they might use off the yoga mat in daily life. That can be really fun. Or trying a new approach. Today we're going to do our flow from the back of the mat, not the front of the mat. Or today we're doing sun salutations with a block between our knees to see how that changes our transitions. You can have fun in lots of different ways. And if you are the teacher for whom fun means finding accessible ways to teach everybody inversions or arm balances, well, that can be fun too. That can really pique your creative spirit to find ways to create an option for everyone, even if they're doing it in a chair or against the wall or with a bolster or a couple of blocks underneath them. Fun is definitely in the eye of the beholder. And I think the beholder includes both teacher and student. But I guess if you're asking this question, I would really do some inquiry in terms of what's fun in my own practice. What do I turn to when I want enjoyment? And you might be surprised that maybe what you enjoy isn't what you see when you do that Google search. And maybe the same thing is true for your students. Maybe what you think they think is fun is actually not what they're coming to the practice for.
I totally agree. And here's the thing. I think as yoga teachers, we often put so much pressure on ourselves to be creative and come up with new sequences. And, especially as vinyasa teachers, to come up with creative flows. We all enjoy that, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
pleasurable to be in a class where you can kind of get lost in flow. But I think what's more interesting to me is, what is it that interests me? Like, what is it about that? Is it getting lost in flow? Is it the entrainment of my nervous system? Is it, an interesting new movement that I'm playing with? And, I think for me personally, at least, and I'm assuming for a lot of other teachers, when I fall into that trap of feeling like I have to keep creating more creative content, I start to enjoy it less. It starts to feel like more of a task. But if I can live in that place of intrigue and awe and thinking about what's interesting to me, that's pretty much where all my classes come from. Either work I'm doing with patients or students, or in my own practice, a lot of times, what's interesting and helpful to the people I'm working with or to myself, and then translating it in a way that's relevant to a broader population. So, like if I'm working with a lot of rotator cuff patients, I might bring some things that I found helpful with them, besides needles, besides acupuncture. I might bring some things that are helpful that I found helpful, um, and again, make it a meaningful conversation, whether someone has rotator cuff issues or not, without instilling fear-based language, but bring it in a way so that everyone can learn. People who practice with me over time get a tool belt of things that they can use and apply, of how to move with more curiosity and mindfulness. And so, yeah, I think for me, the big thing with taking that pressure off and having fun and being creative and inspirational as a teacher is really living in that intrigue of your own practice, and then being able to translate that to an all levels class, if that's what you teach, or whatever class you teach.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I'm really glad that you spoke to the pressure to keep coming up with the shiny and the new, because, yeah, I love a creative flow. I have a lot of fun creating them for yoga medicine online, but often that's not what I'm teaching my people in person. And whenever I feel that kind of crushing pressure to, oh, what's a transition I haven't done lately, or what's a pose that I haven't done for a while, to me, that's a really good signal that I need to set that aside and find something simple that's interesting. And so that might inspire me to do exactly the same flow 3 times. And the first time I focus on the feet, and the second time I focus on the hips, and the third time I focus on the neck and shoulders. Or if I'm doing yin, it might inspire me to do one single pose for the whole practice and just do little variations in arm position or leg position to see if those tiny details can now start to intrigue me as much as the really big, fancy, full body movements. So yeah, I think it's really important if you're feeling external pressure to come up with something, in capital letters, fun. Maybe it's time to set that aside for a moment and to do a little bit of personal inquiry. What actually interests you? Why does that feel like pressure and not an invitation? What would feel more like an invitation to you in your teaching? And you might be surprised at how your students respond.
Yeah, I think there's so much that we can offer as a teacher. It can almost be overwhelming. And anytime I put that pressure on myself, it kind of restrains that
Mm.
creativity. So, and I think as a group teacher, especially if you're teaching a lot of all levels classes throughout the week, you kind of spoke to this a moment ago, but I think there's something really brilliant about being able to have a similar either sequence or theme, or maybe both, and using it through the week. Maybe it progresses, maybe it just evolves. As a teacher, we kind of evolve how we relate to it. And maybe it's a more physical theme at the beginning of the week, and it kind of turns into a more philosophical theme. I mean, you could have um, you know, a very specific, maybe we were talking about rotator cuff, maybe something around the rotator cuff, and maybe toward the end of the week, the theme really becomes more about compassion and seeing clearly into that nature of our suffering and how we inflict suffering and what we do when we're experiencing discomfort. I mean, there's a lot of layers that I think are really important to look at in yoga, and it leaves some room to examine those, and then to not feel like we have to keep making new content up. But then it also allows our students to create some depth and meaning around this content rather than just like getting this kind of drive-by approach of just getting a brief interaction with it in one class and then never seeing it again. And again, why I love the online platform, because you can come back to things. We know that the things that are really most helpful are the things that we are able to come back to and repeat. And sometimes that might be the student who comes up to us after class and is like, that was so helpful for me. And you can say something like, oh, well, you know, maybe we were paying attention to our feet or our legs or some specific cue that they can come back to in other classes. I love it when we can bring those nuances into other classes. So then they can connect to it in other ways rather than just experiencing that connection to it once,
Mhm.
and then never feeling it again, which is going to have a limited effect on us. So I think, being able to have that repetition is important as well. So again, you don't need to keep creating new classes. There's something really interesting about repeating things. And I think we're also inundated with options now,
Mhm.
and it's really nice to get some of that.
Yes, I think we've gotten to the point of being able to start to kind of sum things up. And the first place that you started, which I think is just so important to keep reiterating for people, is your one class cannot perfectly appeal to everyone. You don't know what they came with, you don't know what their expectations or their needs were. So, step one always needs to be to teach to the stated class level and description. And that might be a longer term conversation with the venue that you teach at if you feel like there's an unmet need that you want to meet, or, some modality that you want to play with that there isn't currently space for. But for now, you've got to make sure that you are teaching to the stated class level and description. And in terms of safety, set aside the crushing pressure to keep every person completely safe at all times. Not possible. You cannot know what's going on inside that person and what could be the last little straw that triggers irritation or inflammation. So set yourself free from that, but create a class atmosphere that is really open and invitational, and that sets the student in charge of their experience, that it explicitly states that they can leave things out, add things in, go more slowly, move more quickly, take a break, find a shape they're really happy in, and stay there. And then you provide reasonable options along the way to practices that you think might be challenging. And instead of offering them in a hierarchical way, here's option one for those of you that can't do much. And if you're better, then you can do option two. And if you're awesome, then you can do option three. But to really specify what of the experience is going to be different in each of those options. And so why might each of them appeal to you just depending on what you need from today? And then in terms of fun, if that for you means, fancy flows and challenging transitions and arm balances and inversions, great. If that matches your stated class description, have fun with that and challenge yourself to find ways to make that accessible to at least most of the people in the room, to give them kind of stopping points or pausing points along the way. But maybe your actual experience of fun is something else. It's a little more exploratory and curious and invitational. It's about trying new ways of doing things or new modalities or playing with the nervous system, as you suggested, and be open to the possibility that your students' perception of fun might also be different from what you're thinking it is. And I guess the final thing that we talked about was set yourself free from thinking that you have to come up with something fresh and new and fancy in every single class. Be willing to repeat, be willing to lean into simplicity at times, and accept that you are not the right teacher for every single student. And it's okay if they're looking for something that is different from what you're excited and intrigued by.
Absolutely. That was a great summary. I think the only thing I would add is that for me as a teacher, I think I'm also just constantly um, considering this investment in the people who come back. Not that I'm not conscious of and actively supporting people who are new, but I'm also keeping in mind that there are going to be people who don't come back for whatever reason. Maybe they're traveling, maybe they are looking for something else. Like you said, I'm not the right teacher for everyone, but I want to just be conscious of not needing to give everything every time. I think this can be really draining and depleting as a teacher, and finding that purposeful moment, those purposeful things, knowing your demographic, and you will attract those people to you if you teach from this place of teaching what's interesting to you, what you want to be teaching. You will draw those students to you. And of course, in an all levels class, you'll always have some outliers who are either new or more advanced, or adding in and embellishing in other ways. And that's okay. When that happens, I might be adding in some extra options, or maybe even just an extra pose option or something else that they can do. But I'm still really catering to the people who I know are the bulk of my demographic, or my class description, or my stated class level. And watching how that evolves, I think there's nothing more beautiful than watching how the people who practice with you over time evolve, not just physically, but I think even more interestingly as humans and as a community. And it's such a sweet process. And so, yeah, I think such a helpful conversation. So many great nuances in there as a teacher, things that we can all reflect on and learn from. I think we can always learn and grow and improve our language and our cueing and the nuances and reflections in our practice. And so, hopefully, this gives you some good insights to look into.
And I'll link to the
Um,
previous episode with Elena Chung. I'll also link to the sequencing training, which talks about this quite a bit, about kind of setting yourself free from the pressure to be creative in inverted commas and to find ways to make the process a little easier on yourself.
right, and I think all of absolutely, yes, those are the touch points, the main touch points. And I think anytime you're feeling a lack of inspiration or creativity, for me especially, and I know everyone is nourished and fed by different things, but I find most of the people in our community are very curious. And for me, it's just a reminder to come back to learning for myself, whether that's maybe you've kind of backed off on your own personal practice, or maybe that's sitting down and reading books or research or taking a course or a training. And I think all of our trainings can provide a lot of inspiration to this purpose-driven content in a lot of different ways, depending on whether you're drawn to um, more alignment and orthopedic focuses like the shoulder, the hip, or the spine, or more meditation, or yin, or nervous system and restorative, or myofascial release, or female health, or oh my gosh, there's a bunch of others. Trauma informed yoga. yoga for athletes. What am I missing, Rachel?
We will link to every single yoga medicine training.
No. We don't need to link to all of them. My point is there's a variety, and the whole point of what we do is allowing teachers to develop as they want to. Not everyone needs to learn and know all of those things as a yoga teacher. Like we said before, take the pressure off. You don't need to know it all. You don't need to wait until you've done all the trainings. Go be of service. Remind your students that they are ultimately the ones in charge. Empower them with options and tools and some fun tidbits, which again is open to subjectivity, and know that your teaching is always evolving. And we hope these discussions are helpful. If you have other questions, we love hearing your questions and insights for next episodes. So leave us a note anywhere is fine, YouTube or Instagram, and we look forward to next conversations. We hope it's helpful.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you like the show, please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com, or check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine. You can also email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being a part of our Yoga Medicine community. We look forward to seeing you again. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.